Hey guys, so today we're talking about what's, in my opinion, the most underrated con job in history. It's about a man named Gregor McGregor in the made-up country of Poyais. In the early 1800s, colonizers and soldiers were present throughout Central and South America. And in one particular section of the coast in modern day Honduras and Nicaragua area called the Mosquito Coast, there was a tribe of natives who were called the Poyas people, who were mostly friendly towards the British. The British then started giving certain members that they worked with titles, like the equivalent of being the king or the prince or a nobleman of the area. And bizarrely, natives began respecting these titles that were being given out as though they were the real thing. So if the British people said you were the king in the area, that you were the king. The British also liked to take advantage of these people by importing a bunch of alcohol to the area, getting them drunk, and then having these kings and noble people just sign over big tracts of land. I don't know if that was the whole point of giving them these titles in the first place, to say, oh, you have authority, and now we know that if you give us something, that there's some legitimacy to it. One way or another, Scotsman named Gregor McGregor uses this sort of situation to his advantage, ends up with about 70,000 square miles of land on the coast. Gregor McGregor is something of a businessman, you could say, since he doesn't decide like, oh, I'm going to go and take this land and develop it. He takes kind of the temperature of the economy at that time in Great Britain, which was one of low interest rates, which we've seen, lately what that leads to, which is speculation and the hunt for yield and that sort of thing. And he decides, rather than doing his own development of the area, he's going to sell rights to that development. So he goes around the London area and he draws a nice looking grid over this area of land that he sort of owns at this point, and start telling people there's all this great prospect of natural resources, that we're going to be growing maize in 3 seasons a year, and we're going to be chopping down trees and exporting all these woods and etc. And he says, I'm going to put an export tax on the settlements that we bring there. You guys are going to make 6% on these bonds versus the 3% you can get on like the British equivalent of a treasury at that point. So, double your money or not double your money, double your rate of income, and it's basically going to be no risk. So he gets enough interest in these that he's selling 200,000 pounds worth of them. In addition to his pitch that everything is going to be great, even though there's really no one there yet, he goes to his homeland in Scotland and starts recruiting people to actually go do the settling. And the pitch to them is pretty similar to the pitch that he gives to the people in London who have the money. He says, hey, listen, I've got this area in Central America. If you want to go on this great adventure and be one of the first settlers, this is the opportunity for you. However, he, at a minimum, oversells what's going to be happening there. He says that there's this whole tribe of natives there that are going to help you out and get you started, kind of like act as your servants. He says that there's already something of a settlement there that you can kind of walk into, start a farm. Everything grows without even trying. It's like this Utopia miracle land. And people buy it. Why do they buy it? It's not totally clear. It seems like there's almost this two-way street where the guys in London who were giving the money were pitched that like, this place must be legit, because why would all these Scottish settlers be signing up to go? And on the other hand, the Scottish settlers were signing up to go because they heard, well, this place must be legit. There's just these, financiers in London that put down 200,000 pounds to make it happen, which is, even now that sounds like a decent amount of money, but 200 years ago, that was a ton of money. So obviously, things are not as rosy as Gregor McGregor is pitching them. There are natives there that are probably not going to kill them, but they're certainly not just going to, meet them at the shore and start farming for free for them. There's also land there, but it's really not that great. So at this point, he's almost got like a 3-part scam going. There's this land that he probably doesn't even own, both because of the way he had it written over to him by the natives under the influence of alcohol. Also because if anyone had owned it that wasn't the natives, it was probably the Spanish, not the British in the first place. So any claim he had was dubious. So he's selling land that's not his. He's selling this land that's not his as being this great, super fertile area, which it's not. So he's getting cash from the people in London. And then he's got these people in Scotland who he's about to send, kind of just hoping they make it work. So they go. There's 43 people on the first ship that make landfall and immediately are kind of like, maybe they dropped us off in the wrong place. They know they're in Central America, but presumably at that point in time, that sort of thing happened where like you're off by whatever, your compass is 20, 30 miles off or something, and so you're close but not quite there. But they figure, well, this is where we're at, so we're going to have to try and make the best of it for now. So kind of critically, just immediately, it becomes apparent that there's going to be issues besides just the fact that this place isn't as nice as advertised. Like, all the supplies that are getting brought to the shore by the people who had made this trip are in barrels, and they don't realize, I guess, that by kind of floating them through the water to shore rather than like keeping them dry, most of the stuff in them is spoiling. So even though they're supposedly going to have, a huge amount of supplies to get them started, a lot of it is getting ruined. And this sort of thing becomes a pattern, as we'll see later. So a couple months later, the next ship comes, because obviously the way communications worked at the time, it wasn't like they could send word back in time to stop the future ships from setting sail to say, hey, this Poyais might not be legit. So 160 more people show up, and they, never mind the first people thinking they were going to show up and kind of find a place with some roads and settlement and friendly natives and farms ready to go. Well, the second ship especially did, because they said, well, there's been 43 people there, for a couple months, things must really be ready to go. They notice immediately this is not the case. A bunch of them start sabotaging parts of the ship that they know it belongs to Gregor McGregor, kind of like, we paid money to set sail on this and he's screwing us, so let's ruin his stuff, which obviously is counterproductive because that's the thing that they're going to need to survive there until they figure things out. There's a group of guys that all of a sudden hop off the boat and announce that they're a bunch of criminals that had come on the trip. Their whole point of doing so was to rob all the rest of the people once they got there. It's, it was a mess. It's becoming worse of a mess. Also, on this ship, and somewhat on the first one, there's a bunch of women and children that Gregor McGregor had kind of lured in, people who were on the fence about going and saying, oh, I'll pay for your wife and kid to go. You just pay me for you, which really is a dark incentive once we get down to it and see the body count that gets put up throughout this journey. So now you've got around 200 people that, again, are not ready for this. They thought, they were going to walk into basically a farm, and they instead walk into the forest that's full of mosquitoes, as is the name of the coast, with 40 people who are already sick, because that's what starts happening. Everyone goes there. They have bad shelters. They're getting rained on. They're, mosquitoes are biting everyone. You're just kind of laying out in the sun all day. People are eating food that got contaminated by the salt water when they tried to bring the stuff for shore in the barrels in the ocean. And so what was a bad time becomes kind of a dangerous and deadly time. And people literally start dropping dead just on the coast after, a couple of weeks from sickness. There's doctors that came over, but the doctors are overwhelmed and the doctors are sick themselves. And to top things off, for these people who are like, well, okay, we got fleeced on this, this land isn't what we thought it was. The king of the Poye people shows up like the real king, not like the guy that was called the king by the British people. And he's just like, yeah, none of you actually own this land, because the title that gave it to Gregor McGregor was BS. So he doesn't, again, at least they're not hostile towards them, but they do say like, all right, you guys can live here, but you definitely need to start paying us rent. But the people have no money, so it's not much of a consolation. At some point, the people decide we need to go get help. So they know that Belize, which is sort of the one English colony that's still on Central America, has people there who might be able to come to their aid. So a couple of guys are, as sick as they are, able to sail to Belize and tell the general there, like, hey, there's a real bad situation going on a little ways up the coast here, where you've got these settlers who is basically just a beach of sick and dying people that need your help. So the guy from Belize goes and surveys the situation and realizes like, yeah, this is pretty bad. So at first he takes all the women and children and rescues them, essentially saves who he can. And then they decide like, we're going to make a second trip back. And at that point, the quote from the captain or whoever was the person who went over to Belize is that every single person is sick except for a man named Todd. Everyone else on the coast must have just been looking at this Todd dude with this killer immune system and being like, F Todd, we hate Todd right now. So now Poyais is abandoned. It basically doesn't exist. Everyone who's not dead is in Belize, but the ratio of the dead to the living was rough. It was about 2/3 of the people who had made it over ended up dying out there. One person, though, that never lived in the area, interestingly, right, was Gregor McGregor himself. He acquired this land, but he just spent all the money having it, living it up and being part of high society. So while this was all happening, right, there's a third ship on the way that also didn't get the news in time to know, like, there's nothing out there for us. These people, though, see what's out there, which is nothing, and they get to go straight to Belize. Now, at this point, Belize is, now it's a country, but then it was this little settlement, basically. And the people there are like, listen, we've, helped you guys out a lot, but we can't just keep taking boatloads of people. Like, we have our own stuff to take care of. They're really good to these settlers, and they don't just kick them out. They essentially go, we know this other place up the road, figuratively, that we would have settled in time. How about we send all you guys up there? It's way better conditions than where you were at. You all came in the first place to try to have an adventure and settle a new place anyways. And they say, we recognize that it was hard for you. You weren't used to the disease and working in this hot weather here, coming from Scotland. So they get them 25 slaves, essentially, and say, you can use these guys to help you work while you adapt. So everyone who had survived Poyais goes up the road to this new settlement, and they fail there just as hard, basically, as they failed at Poyais. So at this point, things are murkier as to what's the deal with Gregor McGregor. Because one of the articles I read brings up the point that McGregor had gotten all the money before anyone left Scotland. Was he just sending these people to their deaths, right? Like, that would be some true sociopath stuff. But what was the point then of sending them there if like there wasn't really any more money to be gained? Did he think maybe it would work? And the evidence seems to suggest that he maybe was delusional, but he also probably did think it would work for a couple of reasons. One, he himself had this crazy background in the military where he had joined all these like local militias that were fighting against the Spanish. So he wasn't, he was a Scotsman, but he was fighting on the side of like Simon Bolivar. And actually, although he was certainly a marketer and would say he had involvement in big successful battles that he didn't do a lot with or that had happened when he wasn't even there, there's at least one and maybe two like huge victories that happened because of his leadership of these people. So he did have the ability to sort of rise to the occasion when his back was against the wall. Maybe he thought that all these people he was sending was going to do the same thing. Additionally, he always said that he had a relative that was part of this thing called the Durian Scheme, which was sort of Scotland's one big attempt at becoming a colonial power, where these people settled in Central America basically with the goal of creating like a contiguous civilized area that could be used like the Panama Canal was sort of before it was built as like an overland route for trade to happen without having to sail all the way down around South America. That ended up failing miserably, and I guess it took down like a huge chunk of all capital in Scotland, which had gotten behind this thing as like their big national moment that it was supposed to be, and instead it was a humiliating failure. So he was thinking, if he can get these people to establish this civilization at Poyais, he could be part of this uplift of his, the Scots people that he was so proud of. And then the third thing that he didn't seem to account for was not only that he maybe was exceptional in his abilities in the army, but the marketing pitch that he had made, which was like, this is going to be easy money that you can make quickly and with low risk, got the people drawn into it that were the worst possible ones to actually throw into a situation where you were going to have to work hard. One of the guys that actually had made it there to the settlement as sort of a specialist, he was a land surveyor, so he was maybe more from the higher part of society. After the fact, he described his fellow colonists like this, saying, "Many conducted themselves in the most riotous, licentious, and quarrelsome manner. Indeed, the major part of the lower classes were too evidently of the most vicious order of society, for I could scarcely have believed that all Scotland could have produced so many idle, worthless vagabonds." In fact, there were people who were living in the area prior to these settlers who had been more or less fine. For example, William Pitt had lived in the area most of his life, and his children left, and they said, with regret. But this theory that maybe McGregor was more of a delusional dreamer and he wanted Scotland to establish this colony and rise back up and, be like Britain or Spain of the era with a colony in America, it falls apart because he gets in trouble, obviously. Like, word gets back since not everyone was dead, and, some people ended up not staying in Belize, and the people in Belize themselves went to the UK and were like, hey, that was pretty messed up what Gregor McGregor did. So he gets in some legal trouble. He goes on the attack and says like that the guys in Belize actually had taken his place over from him and that they were trying to spin things and etc. It's a mess. He somehow doesn't get any sort of significant jail time. He's in for a little bit and gets out. Okay, but then he goes to France. And what does he do in France? He starts selling acres of land in Poyais with this nice map with the grid on it and getting settlers ready to go visit this country to found a colony. So he's doing the exact same thing, but now it's going to be Parisians that are building the society, not Scottish people. So obviously it couldn't really have been about doing something for Scotland. So maybe he was that much of a sociopath that he was just going to take the money and condemn these people to, at best deal with the terrible conditions in land that is not really suitable for farming, and at worst just was assuming they'd be dead, and maybe that means there'd be less people to testify against him later. Luckily, none of the people from France end up going. They all went to apply for visas, I guess. In France, they were a little more orderly than the guys in Scotland, just hopping on a boat, and the administrators in France were like, we never heard of this place, so we're not so sure exactly what's going on. And again, Gregor sort of is getting in trouble for this, but skirts by and times even beats the case. Maybe that was more normal back then, to just like sell land tracts that weren't yours. Either way, he realizes he's probably not going to be able to pull the scheme and get this money from it anymore. So he stops pitching it. Instead, he goes to Central America himself, and he connects with Simón Bolívar and is like, hey, remember when I was a war hero for you guys? I think you should give me a pension and I'll just live in your country until I die. And Simón Bolívar is like, I do remember when you did that heroic stuff. He does just give him a pension, and Gregor McGregor, at the end of the day, basically it works out. He lives on a pension. He doesn't have to work, and that's it.